Yeah, I can make it work. All right, I guess we'll go ahead and get started here. Back in our text in Hebrews. I guess you can see Bethany and I had it out this week. She won. Not really. So I had a little surgery on my heel. I had the same surgery done on my right foot a few years ago, so it'll be about 6 weeks to recuperate. So you can, don't pray for me, pray for my wife, and she'll be basically doing everything for the next 6 weeks, including taking care of me. So anyway, see they put out coffee. I don't know if that's a insult. People need coffee to be able to stay awake in Sunday school or not, but I won't take it that way. So anyway, so we'll go ahead and get started here in just a moment. In deference to you all, I've fashioned a little sock to cover up my toes, so you didn't have to look at my toes sticking out during all of Sunday school. So that might be unsightly. Of course, my wife noticed that there was a hole in the bottom of the sock that I had. She thought that looked more tacky than just my toes sticking out. So I was able to get another one to cover up my toes that didn't have a hole in the bottom of it. So anyway, we'll just give a couple people another minute to get settled in here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. I had surgery on my foot. Yeah, so be about 6 weeks. So yeah, it'll be all right. I get to see what it's like to teach like a rabbi, I guess, in the Old Testament. They always taught from a seated position, so it's supposed to have greater authority than teaching while standing. So we'll see. All right, but we're in picking up back in our text in Hebrews. Chapter 2, we're going to finish off Hebrews chapter 2 this week. If you remember, last time I said we would take some time and go over some questions in the book first. So if you have your book by MacArthur, questions on page 14, and if you have answers for these, great. We'll take time to do it. If you don't have answers, then it'll be really short, and we'll just move on to the text for this morning. So in your book on page 14, the first question, question number 6, refers to a passage that's on the previous page in 13 from Colossians 1, 13 through 20. And we won't take the time to read through that whole passage. But the main question, the first question, in what ways does this passage, the passage from Colossians, echo the themes expressed in Hebrews 1 and 2? Does anyone have, you don't have to give every way necessarily, but if you see any particular thoughts there in that Colossians passage that are supported or reiterated by what we've already seen in Hebrews chapter 1 and 2, anyone want to share some of those? Karen? Yep, all things were created by him. That's in verse 2 of chapter 1, by whom also he made the worlds. Anything else there in the Colossians passage? Anyone noticing? Yep, he's the firstborn. I think it says there, what verse is that in your 18? Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, firstborn from the dead. We see that in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 6. Also, verses 13 and 14, I think, I'll line up with chapter 1, verse 3. Just the work that he did in our redemption, delivered us from the power of darkness. We have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sin. Verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, firstborn again, as my wife already pointed out. That lines up with chapter 1, verse 3. Verse 17, he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And that again lines up with chapter 1, verse 3. So all these truths we see in Hebrews are truths that are expressed elsewhere in Scripture. So these aren't necessarily standalone passages that we have to build our doctrine on. They're well supported by other passages throughout the Scripture. Next question, verse 7. What does it mean to you that Jesus has reconciled you to God? This can be a dangerous question to ask. What does it mean to you? What does a biblical passage mean to you? Because it's not really so much about what a passage means to me, it's what does the passage mean. But this truth that we were reconciled to God, when you think about what's entailed with that, is there anything in particular you think about that just makes you go, wow, I'm reconciled to God? Anybody? Karen? Mm-hmm. Yep. Richard? Mm-hmm. Yep. So it's because of our sin, and as Karen pointed out, and then Richard pointed out that then required a sacrifice. Yes. Yep. Yep. So sin required a sacrifice, something that we couldn't earn. It was freely given. A verse that comes to my mind is Romans 5:10. It says, "For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son." And so I think that clearly illustrates the state we were in prior to our reconciliation. It's not just that we were, weren't with God. We were actually God's enemies, and he took that step, initiated our reconciliation. There was no, third party that came in and said, all right, let's, have an arbitrator and get you two together and see if we can work this out. It was God who took that step to reconcile us to himself. We were his enemies, dead set against him, and he took that step to get that reconciliation. And we'll leave it. Did anyone have any feedback on questions 8 and 9? I don't want to necessarily take the time to go read those other passages unless anyone has any feedback to give off those. Okay. We'll just go ahead and hop into the text for today then. Picking up in Hebrews chapter 2. So last week we covered verses 1 through 4, which you remember that was the first warning passage that the author of Hebrews gave us, which was based on what he had already told us in chapter 1. So in chapter 1, he illustrated the supremacy of Christ primarily to the angels at the beginning of the chapter, to the Old Testament prophets. And so then on the basis of that, in chapter 2, on the basis of Christ's supremacy, superiority, he issues a warning specifically. Do you remember what that warning was against in the first 4 verses of chapter 2? Drifting, right. And was that for believers or unbelievers? Both, yeah, so we saw there are applications for both. For believers, it would be neglecting the spiritual truth that you've received and sort of letting it fall into shambles and drifting that way. For unbelievers, it could be neglecting the spiritual truth you've heard. Maybe you think it's good, you think it's right, but you just don't take the step of faith and believe it. And so you drift on by, the nautical term there, drifting. So either drifting away from your port of safety or just seeing it and drifting on by recklessly, letting it go without any care or concern. So he issues that warning against drifting, and then he returns somewhat to this discussion on the superiority of Christ to angels He picks this up in verse 5 down through the end of the chapter in verse 18, and he very logically approaches this and understands that there might be a question that some people might have, and that they say, well, even if they accept the truth that I gave them in chapter 1, that Christ is superior to angels because of all the things we talked about, he's the Son of God, he is God, and so on, they might raise a question that, well, what about when Christ became man? Man is inferior to angels, so when Christ became man in his incarnation, when he took on human flesh, did he in some way give up his supremacy to angels? Did he void that? Did he lose his supremacy to angels? And so the author wants to address that question here in the rest of the chapter. And he does that with a couple different arguments. The first argument he makes is in verses 5 through 9, and he demonstrates that Christ's superiority was not contradicted by his humanity. And the main principle as we work through these verses, the main principle the author is teaching is that mankind is not inherently inferior to angels. And so Christ, simply by virtue of taking on human flesh, didn't automatically give up his supremacy to angels because mankind's just not inherently inferior to angels. So that's the overarching theme of these verses here. We'll read verses 5 through 9 of chapter 2. It says, "For unto angels hath he not put in subjection the world to come, whereof we speak. But one in a certain place testified, saying, What is man, that thou art mindful of him? Or the Son of man, that thou visitest him? Thou madest him, man, a little lower than the angels. Thou crownest him with glory and honor, and didst set him over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet, for in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. But now we see not yet all things put under him. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man." So he points out here, the first point he makes in verse 5 is it's not angels who have an elevated state that they are eventually going to rule and reign with Christ. He kind of says it in the negative sense, "For unto angels hath he not said." So God never said to the angels, or put into subjection the world to come, whereof we speak. So this world was never put under the control of angels, and we'll see in a moment how that contrasts with the role that men played. We talked about the first week, angels certainly do have a role to play in the economy that Christ has set up or that God has set up. They have a variety of different roles, from being God's messengers, as we clearly see in the Bible, to being agents of God's judgment. We see that sometimes in the Bible, and they perform a number of other functions that we talked about in the first week, and we don't need to reiterate all that. However, this status is not a permanent arrangement. There is coming a time, and the author speaks of this in verse 5, in the world to come, the Messianic kingdom, where things are going to be reversed. So right now, angels are in a position of superiority over mankind, but that's not always going to be the case. On some cross-reference passages, we won't take the time to look, but I'll just read them to you. Revelation chapter 3, verse 21 says, "To him that overcometh, I will grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame, and am set down with my Father in his throne." That verse speaks to the position of believers. Revelation 20, verse 6, "They, believers, shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. And then 1 Corinthians 6:3, "Know ye not that we shall judge angels?" And it's not clearly understood what all is entailed with that, meaning that we're going to judge angels. It could be speaking of judgment coming on those fallen angels. It's not elaborated on. But in some sense, we're going to have a position of authority over the angels eventually. So angels do, for now, hold a position of superiority over man, but it's temporary. There is coming a point in time at which mankind is going to be elevated. It's man who's going to sit, as we see in Revelation 3:21, We're going to sit with the Father in his throne. We're going to reign with him for 1,000 years. We're going to be the ones who execute judgment on angels in some form. So if angels were simply inherently superior to man by the mere fact of being angels, then that would always be the case. Angels would always be superior to man. But it's clear that at some point in the future, the Messianic kingdom and forward, mankind is going to be elevated in a position superior to angels. So there isn't anything inherently inferior about mankind compared to angels. So simply by taking on human flesh, Jesus didn't give up his superiority to angels because mankind's just not inherently inferior to angels. So the author of Hebrews then references verse 6 is a quote from Psalm 8:3 and following, and we won't take the time to look at the cross-reference there. But 8:3 asks the question, or verse 6, what is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him? Thou madest him a little lower than the angels, thou crownest him with glory and honor, and didst set him over the works of thy hands. And as MacArthur puts it in his notes in the book, basically, why would God even bother with man? When you look at the whole scope of creation, all of the universe, all of the multiple universes they think there might be, and the galaxies and stars and everything else, man is next to a speck of nothing and compared to the whole of creation. So it's just kind of asking this question. When you look at all of creation, what is man in the light of all creation that you would focus so much on him? It says, what is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man? And both of these, man and son of man, are just a reference to mankind. Son of man there is not a reference to Jesus Christ. Some people, we understand that Christ sometimes refers to himself as a son of man, but this is not a reference in the same sense. So man and son of man there are both just synonymous references to humanity. And in verse 7, the author does note that mankind has been made a little lower than the angels. And you say, thou madest him a little lower than the angels. And you say, well, you just said mankind is not inherently inferior to angels. And that's true. And the author of Hebrews goes on to elaborate that truth here in just a moment. Now, depending on your translation, the King James says, thou madest him a little lower than the angels. Depending on your translation, yours might say, thou madest him for a little while lower than the angels. Does anyone's translation here this morning say that? A little while? Okay, my wise. And so that just illustrates the truth. Either I guess it's a difficult word to translate there in the original text, and so some translations say a little lower, some say for a little while lower. It's a minor point to quibble over because both are true. Man is a little lower than the angels, and man is for a little while lower than the angels. It is eventually going to change. But just in case you're using a translation where that's worded a little differently, it's not a problem. Both ways of wording it are true. So the author here does make the point that in some senses, man is a little lower than the angels. Can you think of any ways that mankind is lower or inferior to angels right now? Dong?
Man will die.
Yeah, that's the big one. Man is mortal. So we know the passage is appointed unto all men once to die, and after this the judgment. So mankind is mortal. Angels, of course, are immortal. Angels, of course, have all sorts of powers. They demonstrate throughout the scripture that they get from God. Mankind can't do those things, and angels have lots of supernatural abilities that mankind doesn't have. But the big one is that man is mortal and angels are immortal. So as we continue to look at the text here, this state of inferiority that the author points out here is not permanent, since we are eventually going to rule and reign with Christ. So though on one hand man is a little lower than the angels, we hold a privileged position, and we see that privileged position brought out here by the author of Hebrews. And beginning at the end of verse 7, or halfway through verse 7, it says, Thou crownest him with glory and honor, and didst set him over the works of thy hands. And then verse 8, Thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet, for in that he put all in subjection under him. He left nothing that is not put under him. So in the original intent of God's design, what is the author speaking of here, do you think, in those sections I just read from verse 7 and 8, the role that man, we could say, was supposed to play in the original creative design? If you turn over to Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and following. Yep, he was, as was just mentioned, he was supposed to be the caretaker of God's creation. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26. And I'll just read these next few verses here. And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image, and the image of God created he man, male and female created he them. And God blessed them and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, and which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green tree for meat, and it was so. And so in God's original creative design, mankind was supposed to exhibit dominion over the earth. He was supposed to rule over the earth, and he was supposed to subdue the earth. But did we see that come to fruition and completion? Yes or no? No, we didn't. What was the reason that didn't come to fruition? Sin, yeah. Sin entered the picture when Satan tempted Eve. Sin entered the picture, and the author of Hebrews points us out at the end of verse 8. But now we see not yet all things put under him. So the author of Hebrews points out mankind was supposed to hold a more elevated position than he does hold right now. It was God's original intent, God's original design, God's original plan for mankind to hold a higher position than he holds right now. But much of that was voided for a time being once sin entered the picture, and then the curse was then put upon man. So those things were given up. So that's why he says at the end of verse 7 and 8, this is the way you designed it. This is the way you intended it to be. And at the end of verse 8, but we see not yet all things put under him. And he says not yet, because there is coming a time when things will be set right, when Christ returns. But for the time being, things are not the way that God intended them to be at creation. And then we move to verse 9, and we have just a fantastic contrast. Verses 7 and 8, again, it's the way God intended it to be. God wanted man to have this elevated position in his creation. The end of verse 8, but it didn't work out. Sin entered the picture, so we don't see God's original intent come to fruition yet. And then you come to verse 8, we see the failure of man in verses 7 and 8, and then we come to verse 9, it says, but on the other hand, we see Jesus. And so he points to the life of Christ here, and he focuses on the humanity of Christ by using only his human name. He doesn't refer to him as Jesus Christ or the Son of God or anything like that. He says, but we see Jesus. And he's focusing on his humanity here because it's humanity that he's focusing on throughout these verses to demonstrate that he's still superior to the angels even in his humanity. So, like mankind was made a little lower than the angels, Jesus was also made a little lower than the angels. He said, but we see Jesus who was made a little lower, or was made for a little while lower than the angels. But then he goes on, he wasn't just made lower than the angels for no reason. What does he say is the reason Christ was made lower than the angels? There in verse, somebody said it. Yeah. He was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death. There was a purpose. There was a reason that Christ was made a little lower than the angels in his humanity. Matthew 20, verse 28 says that Christ came to give his life a ransom for many. So the author highlights this truth that is then elaborated on in verse 10, or rather verse 9, being made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that by the grace of God he should taste death for every man. So whereas man failed in his original task, the first Adam, we know Christ came as the second Adam, and he succeeded in every task that was put before him in his humanity. And we don't have time to get fully into the duality of Christ's nature, that he was fully God while at the same time he was fully man. And so the things that he endured in his flesh and his humanity aren't negated by the fact that he was also deity. He still endured those things fully in his humanity. So mankind failed, but the author says, but on the other hand, in verse 9, we see Jesus. He came and he fulfilled every task perfectly, and it's through Jesus that man will eventually be able to fulfill God's original plan. So man failed, and Jesus came, he succeeded, and because of his success and what he was supposed to do, mankind is eventually going to be able to ascend to the position that he was given initially at creation. So this first argument then just summarizes that although mankind is presently a little lower than the angels, that was not God's original plan, and it's not a permanent arrangement. Thus, you can't say that man is inherently inferior to angels and that Christ gave up his superiority to angels simply by virtue of taking on human form. And so that might be one argument people might have had as well. Man is obviously inferior to angels, so if Christ became man, then he gave up his superiority to angels. The author points out, no, that's not true. The next point takes up the rest of the chapter, beginning in verse 10 on down through the end of the chapter in verse 18, and focuses on Christ's suffering and humiliation. And the author makes the case here that Christ's superiority to the angels was not compromised or contradicted by his suffering. And so he kind of begins to segue into this point at the end of the first section there in verse 9, and then he uses that as a springboard to the next topic here in verses 10 through 18. And he understands that one might say, okay, so I understand that Christ is superior to the angels, and I can see, based on what you've given, that man's not inherently inferior to angels, so Christ's superiority wasn't given upon those grounds, but surely the indignities he suffered in his human body would have in some way voided his superiority. After all, you'd say he was beaten in his human body, he was laughed at, spit on, slapped, punched, stripped naked, paraded around, humiliated, hung on a cross for all to see, and scorned and laughed at while he was on the cross. It surely doesn't seem like the image of someone who is superior to angels. But the author makes a few points here in relation to the suffering of Christ. Now, even his suffering did not do anything to negate the superiority that he exhibits towards angels. First, in verses 10 through 13, he points out that his suffering was necessary in order to complete his identification with humanity. If Christ hadn't suffered as he did, he wouldn't be able to fully relate to what it is to be human. It says, for it became him, or it was fitting, it was appropriate, it was necessary, for whom are all things, again referring to his involvement in creation, and by whom are all things, and bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering. So to make the captain of their salvation just refers to Christ as the originator of our salvation, to make him perfect through suffering. For both he that sanctifieth and they who are sanctified are all of one, for which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the church will I sing praise unto thee. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children which God hath given me. So in verse 10, it tells us that his suffering was necessary. It says to make him perfect through suffering. And we understand, I think, in many places where the scripture uses the word perfect, it doesn't mean perfect like we do. We think of something perfect meaning flawless. It doesn't mean here that Christ had some flaws that needed to be worked out, and his suffering sort of purged those flaws and made him perfect. No, he was already the perfect, sinless Son of God. The word perfect here means make him complete, to bring to completion. So his suffering on the cross sort of completed the task he was called to do in order to save mankind, but it also completed in his ability in order to be able to relate to mankind, to be able to sympathize with mankind. And we'll see a little bit more on that in a moment. But it goes to him, the role that he plays as our perfect high priest. We'll see that in just a moment as well. So because of this, Christ can in all ways relate to us in our humanity. We think there's a lot of times, especially in the media these days, where people try to relate to others. Specifically, I think of a lot of times celebrities. These are maybe millionaires, multimillionaires, sometimes billionaires who get on Twitter or Instagram or whatever other means, and they kind of preach a message to us regular folk about these are the things you should be doing and, to achieve whatever. Whether it's for global warming or social justice or all these things. And they want to have a message for us about the way that us regular folks should live our lives. And you think, you're a billionaire. You've got bodyguards and you live in a mansion. What do you understand anything about my plight as a regular workaday Joe? But, this goes on all the time. They try to relate to us and explain to us how we should live. But with Christ, we have someone who endured all the things that we're going to endure in our flesh, and so he can relate to us in our humanity. And the perfection of his humanity flows in to verse 11, and we see the relation that he has. It says, both he that sanctifieth is Christ, they who are sanctified, believers. So it says both Christ and believers are all of one. So we are one. We're one in our humanity, because of what he endured in his flesh. We're one spiritually through God the Father. And it goes on to say there, for which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren. So this identification with humanity goes to the extent that Christ goes so far as to call us as believers his brethren. And to me, that's a pretty amazing thought, that Christ doesn't look at us as his subservient servants, little minions who go about doing his will, which obviously we understand as relation to God that we are his servants, but Christ looks at us as his brethren, his brothers and sisters in Christ. And to me, that's just a really remarkable spiritual truth there. So in our common descent from Adam, Christ is further identified with mankind in our humanity. And this ties back then to the author's original point that mankind is not inherently or inferior or ultimately inferior to angels. And then the author gives three quotes beginning in verse 12, three Old Testament quotes, and we won't take the time to look at these from the Old Testament. But verse 12 is taken from Psalm 22, verse 22. And this was certainly demonstrated throughout the Gospels. It says, I will declare thy name unto my brethren in the midst of the church. I will sing praise unto thee. And certainly Christ in his ministry did declare the name of God the Father among his brethren. Christ said in John 17:6, I have manifested thy name unto the men which thou gavest me out of the world. And so this was something that Christ manifested. The next two quotes in chapter 13 are taken from Isaiah 8, verses 17 and 18. It says, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the church I will sing praise unto thee. Verse 13, this is the quote from Isaiah. I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children which God hath given me. So these are just verses in which Christ directly relates to mankind. So Christ wasn't some indifferent being who came to accomplish this task, but he didn't really want to be a part of, the beings that he came to save. He came and fully identified with mankind in order to accomplish the task that he was going to accomplish. So Christ's suffering was first necessary to complete his identification with humanity, and then the author then goes on to demonstrate, beginning in verse 14, how Jesus was pleased to be thoroughly identified with mankind. And his suffering was also necessary to destroy the devil. He says, "For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood," and flesh and blood is just a way of saying humanity, so we are flesh and blood, he also, Christ, took part of the same, saying he took part of the same as he became flesh and blood himself. So Christ became human himself, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So this is speaking again to the fact that it was necessary for Christ to take on human form, to take on flesh and blood, as it says there in verse 14, in order to defeat sin and Satan and death. Satan introduced sin into the human realm. Sin was committed then in the human realm, and the penalty of sin was then exerted or applied in the human realm. So as the penalty of sin is imposed in the human realm, it was necessary for Christ to enter the human realm, to take on flesh and blood in order to defeat Satan and to take on that penalty himself. We, of course, know God is a spirit. He can't die. So it was necessary for him to take on flesh and blood to bear the penalty that we were supposed to bear. It was the only way to defeat sin and Satan. And the word destroy there in verse 14 means to make ineffective or render inoperative. And it tells us as believers, as a result of this, in verse 15, believers have been released from the bondage of fear of death. And we certainly know that fear of death is something that enslaves certain people. It's not something that should be troublesome to believers ourselves. Not that we have a death wish and we go around taunting death, but we shouldn't be fearful of what comes after death because we've been saved and we know what the Scripture tells us, and so we have this confidence through the suffering of Christ that we can also have freedom from fear of death as well. I heard John MacArthur preach a message once unrelated to this, but he had a quote that applies. He said, "For the believer, the transition from life to death is less jarring than the transition that took place at our conversion." So for us to go from life to death is, for the believer, a fairly seamless transition, whereas the transition that took place when we went from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light was much more drastic, much more dramatic than anything that will actually take place at our death. So we have this freedom from the fear of death here. And then in verse 16 he says, "For he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham." And we don't need to fully get into this point. You run into some translation issues again here. Essentially, what's being said is that it's mankind Christ came to help. It's mankind Christ came to save, not the angels. Now, you could also make an application here that if the Son of God saw fit to take on the form of a man, that in itself tells you there's something special about mankind. He didn't take on the form of an angel. He took on the form of a human being. He took on the form of a person. And so that in itself lends some credence to the fact that mankind is not inferior to angels. And the final point he makes in the last two verses of the chapter is that his suffering was necessary to qualify him as a merciful high priest. Since it was mankind he was going to help, it was appropriate for him to become a man in all things. So if he had come and experienced life generally as a man, but didn't allow himself to experience any suffering, what good would that be? I mean, we need a high priest who can relate to us, who can associate with us, and who can say they've experienced the things that we've experienced. So suffering is a significant part of our human existence. So for him to truly identify with the human condition, he then also had to experience some human suffering. He experienced human need. We know he went through his life experiencing need, so he can empathize with those who are in need. And even greater than that, and more relevant specifically, as you think about who this letter was written to, as we talked about, it was written to Jews somewhere. We don't know who, but we believe it was written to Jewish believers. And there was a temptation for those Jewish believers to leave their newfound Christian faith and go back to Judaism. One, it was something familiar, something they knew, but there was also relative safety in Judaism. Jews, for the most part, weren't suffering persecution at this time, whereas Christians were. So there's a temptation to say, avoid the suffering, avoid the persecution, just go over here to relative safety, go back to Judaism, and you can be safe over there and just get rid of this Christian faith. And so that's the temptation that the Jews were facing at the time. So it was relevant for them to know that they had a high priest who could directly relate to that temptation that they were facing. And Christ did face that exact same temptation. If you recall, when he was tempted of Satan in the wilderness, the first temptation that Satan brought to Christ was to bow down and worship him, so that, and he would give, what did Satan say he would give Christ if he bowed down to worship him? All the kingdoms of the world. And so that's something, we know that Christ is going to inherit all the kingdoms of the world, but what was God's plan for Christ to endure in order to inherit all the kingdoms of the world? Suffering, right? He had to suffer and die on the cross. And so Satan was tempting Christ. You can have the kingdoms of the world without the suffering. So avoid the suffering, avoid the pain, avoid the humiliation, and you can still have the reward over here. So it was the same temptation Christ faced, and he passed through it. And so because of that, he could be an encouragement to these Jewish believers that they could endure the suffering, they could endure the temptation, and they could come out on the other side. So it was the exact same temptation to avoid suffering, but as Christ endured, the readers that he was writing to here could also be assured that he was qualified to give them sympathy, to give them aid, and to give them guidance in their times of difficulty. And this is something that no angel had ever experienced, that kind of temptation. No angel ever experienced that we see the temptation of Satan. No angel ever endured human suffering. And no angel could ever possibly do what Christ does in his role as our sympathetic high priest. So his humanity, as we saw here at the beginning of the text, beginning of verse 5, wasn't negated simply by taking on human form, because mankind's not inherently inferior to angels. Wasn't God's design for man to be inferior to angels, and at some point, mankind is going to be elevated back to their status. Mankind is going to rule and reign with Christ during the millennial reign. We're going to judge angels, so eventually mankind is not going to be inferior to angels anymore. So Christ did not give up his superiority in that way, nor did the suffering he endured in his flesh negate his superiority to angels. Rather, it completed his ability to relate to mankind. It completed his ability to serve as a high priest for us, and it completed his ability to defeat sin and Satan. And so it goes back to what verse 10 says there, for it became him. It was fitting, it was appropriate, it was necessary for him to endure all these things in order that he could more fully relate to us in our humanity. So that closes a section of Hebrews that deals with anything relating to Christ's superiority to angels, and I think it's safe to say the author of Hebrews makes a pretty airtight case there. He was able to anticipate objections that the readers of Hebrews might have, the original audience, and kind of head those off at the pass. He was able to anticipate rebuttal arguments relating to the superiority of Christ and his humanity to angels, and he was able to head those off at the pass as well. The next section of Hebrews, chapters 3 and 4, deal with Christ's superiority to Moses. So the author of Hebrews is going to get into some more arguments, shifting gears from looking at angels to looking at Moses. And Moses, of course, because of his status in Hebrew and Jewish history, would have held a very esteemed position in the mind of the Hebrews as obviously the one who led them out of Egypt, led them through the wilderness to the promised land. So it was necessary for the author of Hebrews to demonstrate, as great as Moses is in your eyes, and for all the remarkable things he accomplished for the Jewish people, Christ is even better than Moses. And so he's going to get into that in chapters 3 and 4. So you can read that section in your book. MacArthur picks this up on page 17 of your book, Christ Better Than Moses. He gives a little bit of introductory material there on pages 17 and 18, and then he kind of gets into the text, and that goes for the rest of the book. So you begin to read over some of that material, and then his discussion for chapter 4 begins on page 26. So page 17 begins the discussion on chapter 3, and chapter 4 begins on page 26. So I suspect we'll probably just be in chapter 3 next week. I wouldn't anticipate covering 2 chapters of material, but we'll try to at least cover chapter 3 next week. So you can read chapter 3 out of Hebrews, and then also read the corresponding material from your book, and we'll be prepared for that next week. So with that, we'll close up here in a word of prayer. Dan, can you close us up in prayer?